All right. Good morning, everybody. It's me, Robert Phoenix, and we are back for another edition of the Astro Weather. Look at me. I'm fresh out of the shower, just like a newborn baby, ready to be of service to you. Let me button my collar. It's a little immodest, isn't it? It's me, Robert Phoenix. We are back for another edition of the Astro Weather. Look at me. I'm fresh out of the shower. A little, I got to turn that down a little bit. So how was everyone? It is Valentine's Day, one of those Hallmark holidays. You know what? I think I like it better, like undone. There we go. It's another one of those Hallmark holidays. And if you don't take it seriously and you're in a relationship, you better pay attention. You better pay attention. It's even the most informed and hip and balanced people that I know, especially on the other side of the gender equation. It matters to them. So just a little bit of a word of forewarning, perhaps a little bit of wisdom. Make the extra step and just do the thing. Do the thing. All right, it's been a while since we got into the Astro Weather. I guess we looked at the weekend on Friday. And boy, I have a lot to talk about in a pretty short time to talk about because I'm trying to keep these condensed in as short a fashion as possible, right? Give you as much to chew on in as little time as you can. But there's been a lot happening with train wrecks, and the NBA trading deadline passed last week, and that's called player movement, right? So we have all these things going on with movement. And what's interesting is Mars, because it's felt a lot like a Mercury retrograde in a lot of ways, even though Mercury is not retrograde. And I've been trying to kind of get a handle on, why it feels like a Mercury retrograde. Why are we having all of these derailments all of a sudden? Last night we started to enter into the shooter mode, right? Like the unidentified shooter mode with what happened at Michigan State. And so I've been looking at Mars in Gemini and how, while it's been retrograde, there's been this tension and this holding back of this very restless and relentless force that Mars and Gemini can provide. And now we have it at 13 degrees. So Mars is moving fairly slow. Remember, it went direct at 6 Gemini, and that was on the 13th of January. So here we are a month out, and Mars has really moved, 7 degrees at the most. I think it's 7 degrees, 6 or 7 degrees. Anyway, so now it's starting to pick up momentum. And Mars and Gemini in general tends to be an energy that's pretty reckless. And I'm going to cover some of this on my my stream at 9/11 over on 15 Minutes of Flame. That's OV Flame. And some of the conditions, particularly around the train wreck. Again, the whole thing with the train wreck in East Palestine, Indiana, or Ohio rather, is that it happened on the 3rd of February. And here we are 11 days later talking about it. So to me, that has a lot to do with this deferred kind of tension that's now being released with Mars and Gemini. And of course, Mars is moving closer and closer into square with Neptune. You're going to want to keep an eye on that, because that's when we get into the debate about the Second Amendment, gun grab. They told you what they were going to do during the State of the Union. Whoever is performing the role of Biden was very upfront and saying, we're coming to get your assault weapons. So we had an event last night at Michigan State University, which I don't have all the details on, but there's this famous axiom: don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I don't think they'll let this one rest for too long, in spite of the details. We'll find out more details, whatever those supposed details are. Right. So I think Mars and Gemini, especially as it moves closer into square over the next couple of weeks with Neptune, there's more and more windows. I would say there are more windows into seeing the deleterious effects of Mars moving forward in Gemini. And of course, it's in the second decan now, so it's going to be in the Libra decan, which is all about agreements, right? It was really interesting watching the NBA trading deadline happen as a flurry of deals took place. It was probably the most crazy, deal-packed, frenetic trading period I've ever seen. And one of the things that was really interesting was the amount of players that returned to their original teams. I think there were at least 6 players that went back to a team that they had played for once before, which is unheard of in the NBA. And again, I'm going to attribute that to Mars going direct and being in this kind of stagnant, moribund retrograde phase for that period of time. It was almost like the deferred action or the deferred energy around Mars. So now the interest is due, right? And here it comes. Mars Gemini coming in with a vengeance, an absolute vengeance. And then, of course, over the weekend, we headed into a closer sextile with Jupiter. So that's a lot of energy, Well, what about you? How does today affect you? Well, we have the moon in Sagittarius, and it's coming in, and we have this sextile, right, with Mercury. So we have a really nice kind of fluid feel between how we're feeling and what we're thinking. Things happen very quickly. Think of Quicksilver, think of Mercury, think of elements that are connected to communication and speed and rapidity, right? There's no downtime between what you feel and what you're thinking. And even with the moon in kind of a wide sextile with Pluto, the intensity around what you feel can be processed very quickly. Sagittarius is pretty objective, although it can have its connections and flirtations with dogmatism. And as the moon is just coming out of this square with Saturn, there's the remnants of that, right? So, we're dealing with moving quickly through our emotional experience, and at the same time, having to deal with not being coarse or callous or cold or indifferent, which we can see with that moon Saturn square. The other thing is that moon Saturn squares are notorious for depression. So if you've gotten up today and you're thinking, well, it's another day on the hamster wheel in the shit show, move your body, right? Move your body and figure out a way to, get the dopamine flowing in your brain. And when I have a moon Saturn square in my natal chart. And I remember there was a time in my 20s where I traveled, came back home, and I was going through a really heavy duty dose of depression. And the only thing that I could do for it was run. And I actually was able to get my serotonin and my dopamine levels up by running. And it was not always the best conditions. I remember running in like February on the coast of California, where it could get really damp and really cold and rainy, and I didn't care, right? Like I didn't care. What I cared about was not falling into the trap of depression. So today's one of those days where if you feel like you're stuck, you're spinning your tires, you're in the mud, move, do something, move, change your state. Because with this moon sextile to Mercury Pluto, the state change is very, very effective. Tony Robbins talks about state changes, and I think that's actually a really valid tool that comes out of the Tony Robbins toolkit. Sun Saturn conjunction, it's getting closer and closer, boys and girls. Getting closer and closer here. We're coming up on that conjunction in 2 days. And that is the heavy hand of the oligarchs decreeing that there is one size for all, one rule for all, one decree for all, right? And then there's you who says, no, I'm my own authority. I know what to do. I know what to put in my body. I know not what to put in my body. So we're coming to a bit of a loggerheads here in 2 days. And at that time, the moon will just come in at the end of Sagittarius. So we'll have a very fast sextile again. Instead of the square, it'll be moving into sextile range. And when it moves into sextile range, our emotional capacity, our ability to process things, especially when it comes to, being an individual and being a team player, happens quickly. Like you don't have to waste a lot of time. So this is going to be an interesting week here, and especially when we get into tomorrow, where everything starts to speed up tremendously. And I mean tremendously. We have the Venus Neptune conjunction coming on. So we're about 4 days out from that happening. And Venus Neptune conjunction on Valentine's Day, it's nice. It's nice, right? You can, let your walls down a little bit. Now, the kind of passive aggressive energy, the conflicting energy, the picking a fight energy, I think that we're kind of out of the window with that. Although the Mars Venus square could be a little prickly. Mars Venus squares are actually also quite good for, believe it or not, things like friction, right? Friction, sexual tension, working things out. So if you get into an argument, you can make war and then make love with that Mars square Venus and Mars square Neptune. What else do we have? The moon trining Jupiter. That's sovereignty. That is owning what you feel, right? In Sagittarius, it can be a little dogmatic, but why not? Why not? I don't think this is a day necessarily to step on other people's toes, because you got that nice Venus Neptune conjunction. But when it comes to don't tread on me, I think that's a maxim. That's a maxim for today. Don't tread on me. Don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in to be your quote unquote emotional truth. Now, emotional truths are a little bit tricky because emotions and truth aren't always compatible, right? Sometimes emotions take us into the realm of the lie because they're not always objective. But today is one of those days where if you distill your emotional experience and you understand what you know, then you're able to engage with it and fully put it into some form of ignition, right? Which results in some form of greater cognition, which then results in some form of action based on this trine and then the sextile moving to Mars. Okay, I think that's it for the Astro Weather. Let's take a look at today's star of the day, a very interesting character. Super, super interesting. Today's star of the day is Jimmy Hoffa. And, when I look at these, I try to find people that are compelling and really flex the power of the sign that they're born under. And I had a bit of a debate between James Pike, two Jimmys today, James Pike and Jimmy Hoffa. And James Pike was a minister. He's kind of like Merton in some ways, but a bit different. He's younger than Merton. He doesn't come from the same generation that Merton does, but James Pike was a minister. He was an Episcopal minister who lost his son, and his son jumped out of a window and committed suicide. And so he was on this pilgrimage. And James Pike actually consulted with mediums to try to get in touch with his son. So he was a very Aquarian kind of character. And he and his, I believe it was his girlfriend or fiance, I'm not sure if it was his wife, but they went out to the desert in Israel. They went out to the Dead Sea. They were on some kind of tour and pilgrimage, and they wound up very strangely dying in the desert in Israel from dehydration. And they were not very far. They were like 2 miles from the Dead Sea, and they couldn't hold it together. I read a book on his experience there. Anyway, I thought about James Pike, but it's not him. It's Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa really exemplifies his chart. So if you're going to have a union leader, have your union leader with the sun in Aquarius, Mercury in Aquarius, an Aquarius rising with Mercury on the ascendant. Jimmy Hoffa is the definition of a self-made man. He was born in Brazil, Indiana. I never knew there was a Brazil, Indiana. But his father died when Jimmy Hoffa was 6 years old. I guess he was a coal miner, died young. Family was poor. They moved to Detroit, and Jimmy Hoffa dropped out of high school at the age of around 14 or 15. He was a freshman in high school, so he started working at the local grocery store. They had brothers, they all worked, they all had to contribute to the family. This is a very, very different era, very different period, very different time. You know, he's born in the year when they passed the Federal Reserve Act and they enacted taxation, and the United States would then enter into World War I. So he's incarnating into that period, right? Now, all that stuff would happen later on that year, December that year. So he would be about 7 months old, right, at that time. But was it 7? No, 9 months old, 10 months old. I think 10 months old. Anyway, he eventually winds up working for a company that would unload fruit from a train, and the working conditions were pretty horrible. I think they were making around 35 cents an hour, and they were working 5 to 6 days. I think 6 to 7 days a week. They're working, 10-hour days, and this is a time where America is starting to grow, and so there's a lot of demand on consumer products, particularly food. So one day, and it was during the summertime, where there were unloading strawberries from another train car story, a train car, and Jimmy Hoffa and his co-workers, they were over the harsh conditions. They were not into it. So Jimmy Hoffa had planned this, and he said to his co-workers, "Hey, look, we're not going to lift a finger today with these strawberries." So strawberries spoil rather quickly. And this is during a time where they didn't have a ton of refrigeration. So they would bring the strawberries in, and the idea was that you had to get them off of the freight car very quickly. And Jimmy Hoffa used this to his advantage. And they said, "No, we're not lifting a finger unless you do certain things for us and make our conditions better." And of course, the foreman barked at them and threatened them, but it didn't really work because they had the leverage and they had the advantage, and they got what they wanted. So Jimmy Hoffa became a leader in that day, and they were known as the Strawberry Boys because of their ability to flex their muscle against management. And then he just keeps growing from that point forward, and he becomes a union leader, right? I mean, and he'll do anything, absolutely anything, to strengthen his position. And we can see that here with these squares. So he has a Moon-Saturn conjunction in Taurus, and it's conjunct Algol. I'll get into that in a little bit. And it's in the 3rd house, right? So he's stubborn. Jimmy Hoffa is stubborn. I'm going to drop an F-bomb here. He's stubborn as fuck, right? He's got this fixed ascendant. He's got Sun, Uranus, Juno, all in Aquarius. He's got that Mars at 26 Capricorn, which is very powerful, right? And this is power behind the scenes. And he's willing to tap into that and do anything he needs in order to affirm and assert his position. That Mars will come back later in his life to bite him in the ass, and I'll get into why. And he's also somebody who has the ability to lead. He's got this true node and Venus conjunction in Aries, and it's squaring off against Jupiter. So he's willing to take risks. He's willing to take on management, which is Jupiter in Capricorn, right? So he's like, fuck it, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get out front, and you guys are going to follow me. He also has this Pluto trine to Sun and Mercury. Jimmy Hoffa was no bullshit. This was a guy that would do anything it took to assert his power, his dominance, and use the union, the Teamsters, for his advancement. But he also has this uncanny knack for getting things for other people, right? The Teamsters were the most powerful union in the world. So Hoffa would do anything he needed to, especially with the square. And apparently he would do one of two things. Like if he needed to influence somebody, and there are ways of influencing somebody. Jimmy Hoffa was like a mob boss. It's exactly what he was like. He was a mob boss, and he had ties to the mob, obviously. But if he needed to move the needle on somebody and to get something done, he would hire from within the Teamsters to either hurt or threaten or cause damage to an individual or business so that he could flex muscle, and then they would essentially you get what they need, right? And if it was outside, if he needed to kill somebody, he would hire somebody from the outside. So he would tap into the mob, and he would do that. So he didn't want the blood on the hands of anybody inside of the Teamsters. That was not Jimmy Hoffa. He would outsource any kind of murder. So Hoffa was a very intense guy. And one of the things that he did is he was the vice president of the Teamsters, and he set up the president of the Teamsters. This is how ruthless he was. He set him up, and he started to leak information about the president of the Teamsters. And a year later, after he'd been named vice president of the Teamsters, the president of the Teamsters stepped down, or he was found guilty on some form of corruption, right? Jimmy Hoffa was leaking all that just so he could get ahead and become the head of and this is the head of the Teamsters, right? Remember, Aquarius is all about groups and organizations, and the Teamsters fall into the Aquarian mold, right? They are a group. They're a very, very powerful group. Now, one of the other things that Jimmy Hoffa did is he funneled the Teamsters pension fund into the mob so the mob could build Las Vegas. So Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters helped build Las Vegas. And I'm assuming, although my research has not been able to necessarily give me the data that I need, that money got paid back. Whether it got paid back or not, the Teamsters pension fund was a huge, huge trough that Jimmy Hoffa would pull from. The other thing that's really interesting is that he went through a major battle royale with Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy brought him before the Congress and these special committees for hours and hours and hours of interrogating him. And Bobby Kennedy was a Scorpio, so that's going to be in square with Jimmy Hoffa's Aquarian planets, and also in opposition with the stubborn, really stubborn nature of his moon Saturn. And remember, Jimmy Hoffa is a guy that only had a high school education, a freshman education, and he's going toe to toe with Bobby Kennedy, who was really one of the best interrogators and kind of deep dive researchers with his Scorpio sun. He's going toe to toe with him, and Jimmy Hoffa gave no quarter. A lot of people who have spent time with watching those interrogations were really amazed by how Jimmy Hoffa was able to deal with Bobby Kennedy. So Jimmy Hoffa was a very serious character. And you can see here with the Neptune in conjunct and Cancer, and you're dealing with things like pensions with Cancer, right? Like putting something into a fund, which is going to, feed you and pay you later on. It's also very Scorpionic. We have the in conjunct with Neptune here going into the sun, right? So he's drawing on these he's also drawing on leverage too. Jimmy Hoffa is a huge leverage guy. He winds up going to jail or prison for about 4.5 years. And so here we have the whole 12th house, right? And then he gets pardoned by Nixon. And he's singing the praises of Nixon, which is very interesting. Of course, Nixon being a Capricorn, and his son, somewhere between Jimmy Hoffa's Jupiter and Mars, pardons Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa gets out. And then what does he try to do? He tries to get back into the Teamsters. He tries to muscle his way back in. And his ability to use the leverage and the muscle that he'd used before doesn't work, right? He's been out of the game too long. He's been frozen out. So there's a very good possibility that the same tactics that Jimmy Hoffa employed while he was the head of the Teamsters were then employed on him, which means that he was the subject of a hit. So it was more than likely that the head of the Teamsters was the one that actually bought the hit. And Michael Frances, who is an interesting character, a guy who stepped out of the mob, whose father did about 50 years in prison, Michael Frances, being a made man, knows who killed Jimmy Hoffa, says he's still alive, says he's got tape recordings of it. So Hoffa was killed, and and Frances says that he was deposited somewhere near water. So he's either in the Atlantic Ocean or he's in a river, right? They'll never find his body. It's long gone. And with Mars in the 12th house, what do we have? We have hidden enemies. So Jimmy Hoffa eventually had to pay the piper. If he had just been able to get out of prison and not get back in the game, we'd be having a very different conversation. But he can't, right? He's driven, he's impelled with this cross, right? This square, rather. He's impelled to continue to do what he does. He just couldn't give up, right? He had to get back to the top of the mountain. And there were people that were there who were essentially saying, nope, sorry, you're not allowed back up here. He's a very interesting character. He did not indulge in any kind of vices. Even though he had this Mars-Neptune opposition, he didn't indulge in any vices. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He wasn't a philanderer. He was a family man. He loved his family. He was devoted to his family. But he was a fucking stone cold killer. And he had one goal and one purpose, and that was to become the head of the most powerful union on the planet. And he did so in a time that was phenomenal. The time frame that Jimmy Hoffa was able to accelerate his rise is phenomenal. And I think it's fair to look at somebody like Jimmy Hoffa in the same way that we would look at somebody like Castro or anybody else who is tyrannical. I don't want to say use the word tyrannical, but driven to achieve power. And and I thought about people like Jimmy Hoffa coming out of that period of time where it was a really dog-eat-dog world, and people were really living with hardcore poverty and looking at the haves and the have-nots. And that's what really drove Jimmy Hoffa. That's what drove him. He saw the conditions of the world around him. Another Aquarian who I think was driven by the same kinds of conditions was somebody like Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky spent a lot of time with Al Capone. He wanted to understand how Al Capone's mind worked. He wanted to understand how Al Capone could community organize. Because Al Capone, through the mob, was a community organizer. And so you have somebody like Saul Alinsky who's doing the same thing, right? These people are witnessing these conditions, these conditions that are around during the 20s and the 30s. And man, are they oppressive. They're heavily oppressive. The wealth gap during that time was enormous. And so you have this kind of underclass that becomes these titans. And they're driven by hunger. And Jimmy Hoffa is no exception. He's no saint. Clearly, he's no saint. But in a time where the playing field is stocked with people like Jimmy Hoffa, he knew exactly what the rules of engagement were. And even the Kennedys, who were his foes, understood this. And they played by the same rules, right? They just had theoretically better breeding and a leg up than Jimmy Hoffa did. It's a very interesting character. So today's star of the day is Jimmy Hoffa. All right, going a little bit long today, but he's such a fascinating character in terms of his impact and his rise to power is, I'll drop an F-bomb again. It's fucking meteoric. It's a meteoric rise to power. And then once he gets to the top of the mountain, he is tenacious, absolutely tenacious. All right, let's get into a few other things here. Let me talk about my sponsor. And of course, my sponsor is True Hemp Science. And I was on the phone with Chris last night, and we had a really great conversation. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Chat Taria and everybody who has supported Chris and his business and his work and is allowing him to branch out and do some other things with his work and with the products. So, wow, we got a new little disclaimer here. Wow. So you got to be 21 years old. I got to go in here and, whoops. I guess I don't have to do the here. I'll give him a solid. You got to be 21 years old now to buy the products. You've got to go through a window and a gate. So here we go, truehempscience.com. And these are the products that I use. And I am absolutely looking forward to employing one of Chris's other products besides the hemp, which is really, really good stuff. Really good stuff. But I'm going to start to use, and I was talking with him last night, I'm going to start to use his, where we have load more, one of his other products, which is the biosilica. And biosilica added to water, distilled water, is apparently, it's right there, bioactive silica. I'm going to start to use this. We were talking about this last night. He says it'll help with high blood pressure. So all you got to do is add bioactive silica to distilled water, and then you start to drink that water throughout the day, particularly like the first sip of the day. You should have some of this bioactive silica inside of your distilled water. So I'm going to start using that. But there's all kinds of really great products here for your hemp and CBD needs. And if you use 15 mins, 15 MINS when you check out, you're definitely going to get some free product from Chris. So there you go, truehempscience.com. Use that 15 MINS and get the free products. They're going to come your way. So the other thing, of course, that I have to talk about here is my show, which I'll be doing rather shortly on my other channel, which is 15 Minutes of Flame. Some of you have decided to come on over, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to get into some of the train derailments today and some of the high strange they keep changing. They're no longer UFOs or UAPs. They keep changing the acronyms and the nomenclature. We're going to get into some of that. We're going to get into this Pluto Capricorn end times and the peek into the very strange world of Pluto and Aquarius, which is coming in our direction. So that's 15 minutes of flame.com, 15 minutes of flame, ovflame.com, 9:11 a.m. Central Standard Time, 10:41. We're here for an hour and a half over on that channel, and be sure to join us. Thanks for being here. A little bit long on the Astro Weather side of things. I'm not going to apologize. It's just that Jimmy Hoffa is such an interesting character. And when you see a chart like that, and you see it play out in quote unquote real life, it's really, really interesting. And even though the Jupiter in Capricorn and Jimmy Hoffa being pardoned by Richard Nixon, who's a Capricorn, and getting the benefit of that kind of Capricornian muscle in his life and in his chart. Okay, take good care. Have a great day. Do a little of that Venus-Neptune conjunction. And open your heart a little bit here. All right. Use your head in order to so much fill your heart. 2 steps for what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Take good care and bye for now.